Greetings and salutations, my friends. Welcome to another glorious day here at the Tango Hotel. And today, my friends, we are discussing Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, an upcoming MMO that I am very much looking forward to, and today we will be discussing its crafting systems. Now, I just want to give you guys a heads up that much of this information is taken from the crafting master himself of Visionary Realms, Neffel, and from various live streams and forum posts that Neffel and other VR developers have done where they have discussed the intricacies of the crafting system and some of the stuff that we know for sure will be in the game. Some of the things in this video that I discuss may not actually be in the game. Some of it is stuff that is part of the developer's vision, but may not actually be realized in the full game. Some of it is theory crafting from the devs themselves as well as the community. But I will try to differentiate between that and stuff that the devs have said will, in fact, be in the game. All right, my dudes, now that that is out of the way, let us dive into the nitty-gritty. Okay, so in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, professions and gathering, there will be 6 professions. There will be the blacksmith, the woodworker, the outfitter, the jewel crafter, the alchemist, and the provisioner. Blacksmithing is relatively self-explanatory, as is the woodworker. Outfitter will most likely be clothing, I would assume, capes and such, sewing kind of dealio. Jewel crafter, also self-explanatory. Alchemist will be consumable potions, and the provisioner will be cooking and brewing. As for the gathering skills, there will be 5. There is mining, woodcutting, harvesting, skinning/butchering, and fishing. Most of these are self-explanatory with the exception of harvesting, which will be the gathering of plants out in the wild. There is also a bonus trade skill. I don't know what it really will be classified as, but the devs have stated many times that scavenging will be part of Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, and Neffel has described it as something that could be as simple as picking something up off of a table, but one would assume that considering how much they've talked about scavenging, it's probably going to end up being a little bit more than just finding random bits and bobs around. And so far as how many of these professions you will be able to have, currently you will be able to have 1 non-consumable crafting skill and 1 consumable crafting skill. And the consumable crafting skills are provisioning and alchemy. So that means that you will be able to have blacksmithing, woodworking, outfitter, or jewel crafting, and alchemy or provisioner, which sounds pretty awesome to me. You will also be able to have every single gathering skill in the game. So everyone can mine, woodcut, harvest plants, skin and butcher, and fish. However, you will only be able to specialize in 2 of them. So that means that everyone will have the basics of those, but not be able to achieve the highest of the high end when it comes to every gathering skill. You'll have to pick 2. All right, dudes, I'm going to give you guys a Neffel quote straight from the forums to maybe give you a little bit of insight into the minds of these guys and to understand maybe why every gathering skill will be available. Quote, "We absolutely do want every type of crafting to rely on every type of gathering, or at least as much as makes sense." I'm not going to lie, I was kind of taken aback to learn that we're going to be able to get every single gathering skill in the game. Even though we won't be able to master it, we'll still be able to use it for the most part. But it kind of does make sense. It makes sense because we've heard time and again that the VR devs want every single crafting profession to benefit from various gathering skills. So, to some extent, every single crafting profession will have to have a resource that is gathered from each of the gathering skills. And I'm sure that some will benefit from some gathering skills more than others. I'm sure that blacksmithing will require more mining than anything else. That jewel crafting will also require mining as possibly well as fishing for like pearls and such. Woodworker will probably benefit more from wood cutting than anything else, but might also have things that it needs from harvesting and skinning to be able to craft many of the different items that are going to be within that trade skill. While I'd not only find it surprising, but I also find it interesting that they've allowed everyone to have every gathering profession. I imagine the biggest reason is because they want crafting to be so much more involved that you're going to need things from various other gathering skills, and so they want people to be able to gather the things that they need for their desired profession. They are going to have to be careful in balancing it, though, because you have several factors that you need to look at. One of them is something we're going to talk about later about skill ups, is that if you have skill ups and you have all these different crafting professions, it's going to be hard for you to get your required material at higher level if you didn't go around chopping down a bunch of trees when you didn't need a bunch of wood as a miner/blacksmith earlier in the game. And two, it's going to be an issue with inventory space. Do you carry around all this ore and all this wood and all of these plants and all of this skin that you've butchered and some of this fish? Or do you sacrifice some of that for loot that you've picked up from mobs? It might not be as much of a problem as it is a choice. So that if you really want to roleplay that crafting awesomeness, then you have to make that choice as a player, as your character, as to whether or not you're going to sacrifice your inventory space for crafting materials instead of potentially having lots of fat loot. We were talking about specializations just a bit ago when we were talking about gathering skills and how you'll only be able to specialize in two. Well, you'll also be able to specialize in your main crafting skills as well. However, it is unknown how many specializations per crafting skill they will have. Whether you'll only be able to specialize once and it'll have multiple branches, either 2, 3, or 4, or whether once you've specialized in, say, like a blacksmith specialization of armorsmith and weaponsmith, whether the weaponsmith will be able to actually specialize even more into like swordsmith, daggersmith, hammersmith, and so forth. I am unaware at this time of whether a decision on the direction they're going to go with this has been made, other than there will be specializations for crafting. VR have not released any specifics on which specializations will be in the game. One of the main reasons given for specializations is they want there to be deviation among crafters of even the same craft. So not every blacksmith or woodworker will be able to make everything. So you'll need to go to different people to get different things made. Putting just a bit more of that interdependency in there, even among the same crafting trade. And since we were talking about specializations, I thought I'd mention in this area that the crafting system will be able to take advantage of the mastery system as well. So you will be able to spend mastery points on crafting skills. There is little information on this specifically right now. And I'm unaware that VR has spoken at length about this, only mentioned it somewhat in passing. So I'm assuming that they're going to be implementing it into the game. We just don't have much information as to how exactly it's going to be implemented into the crafting skills. There will also be lootable items in the game known as mastery shards that can be combined via crafting into mastery points. So you will be able to find mastery shards out in the world dropped via mobs or some other means, perhaps more than one, and then you will be able to combine them using some crafting skills. We don't know which ones will be able to do this or if all of them will be able to do this. And for those who need a brush up or for those who are unaware, the mastery system in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen is a point-based system in which you will be able to upgrade your base abilities with mastery points to give them extra effects and or increase their effectiveness in combat. Now we come to the actual gameplay of the crafting system. And gameplay is the correct word, according to Neffel. Minigame comes to mind as to what we will be doing when crafting, but he says that's the wrong word. They don't want it to be tedious or boring. They want there to be actual gameplay involved with you managing your crafting, not just playing a silly minigame. And the stated goals are that they want to make the experience of crafting engaging and fun for players, to prevent the experience from crafting and gathering feeling trivial or tedious, and to preserve the balance between risk and reward. And since we're touching on risk, let's talk about the fact that failing in crafting may involve losing some mats. It's not necessarily a guarantee, but you could lose up to a quarter of the mats that you put into any craft. I believe that was the number that was given. And the reason is for that risk-reward scenario. If you're crafting something that's extremely complicated, you have to be aware that you could possibly lose something if you're not skilled enough. Crafting will also be something that's fairly involved and will not be a simple click to craft. The gameplay will revolve around the trade skill in question. So, for instance, if you're smelting metal, you will have to moderate the temperature of the furnace. I'm hoping on my end that it will not be some weird button pressing mess, and that the gameplay, quote unquote, is very related to the task. So it makes you feel as if you are a real blacksmith or woodworker. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they balance this out and make it a reality. You know, if you're a blacksmith and you're making a sword, you're pounding a hammer, you're heating the metal, that's what you'd be doing as a real blacksmith. You'd be quenching the metal as well. You would also be, adding different alloys in the middle of making it and whatnot. And even as a woodworker, you would be using a machine and judging tension on the cutting blade and what type of blades you're using. And there's all kinds of little nuanced things you can do. And I just wonder how they're going to insert that and incorporate that into the gameplay that they're trying to make. It does sound very interesting and very, very cool. And if they pull it off, they could really capture the role-playing element that most games, and MMOs in particular, lack. In EQ, it was a simple button press, and ipso presto, you have your crafted item or you don't. In WoW, it's click a button and wait for a bar. In many other MMOs, it's very, very similar. There may be mini games involved, but they're usually not games that you would associate with actual blacksmithing or whatever craft that we're referring to. One of my favorites was a non-MMO specifically. It was, I believe it was Fable either 2 or 3. You could get jobs where you were a bartender, where you could make swords or daggers or, be a blacksmith and do various other types of odd jobs that were common in the medieval era, sort of. And the game was watching a bar that was an arc, and a line would bounce back and forth between the edges, and you had to time your button presses just right for, the beer pour or the smacking of the hammer. So it wasn't really related, and it was just a silly little button pressing minigame, and I absolutely hated it after hours and hours of doing it. And I really hope that we avoid stuff like that in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. I will not be very happy if that's the case. So for non-consumable crafting, you'll have a little bit of freedom to mix and match with your recipes. For instance, let's say you're making a sword and it calls for metal. What type of metal you use is entirely up to you. And depending on what type of properties you want that sword to have, depends on what type of metal you will use in it. I have heard it stated that the devs do not want there to be a strided tier list of metals, so that there's not a metal from 0 to 10, there's not a metal from 10 to 20 and 20 to 30 and so on and so forth, that there'll be a variety and a mix all throughout the game, including mixing metals into alloys at later levels so you can make stronger, more effective items. Now, of course, this system will not be entirely freeform. Your one-handed sword will require many different components, and you will simply be able to choose what metals you use to make certain components. And the way it was stated, one has to assume that this will be the way it will be for almost all, if not all, of the non-consumable trade skills. The consumable trade skills, however, will be far more freeform. In fact, it was stated emphatically that this is going to be the case, that you will be able to experiment with different ingredients and be able to come up with your own recipes and so forth. I'm assuming it would work with alchemy as well. It was stated more for cooking, where you'll be able to have a frying pan that holds 3 ingredients, and if all 3 ingredients are meat, it'll come up with a barbecue platter. Or you throw some meat and veggies in there, and it could come up with like stir fry. So it'll be things like that. And from that, we can probably infer that alchemy will have a similar design. When both harvesting and crafting items, there will be a little bit of RNG involved. And I know each and every one of us are absolutely ecstatic to hear those words, RNG. It just warms your heart, doesn't it? An example of this could be, when mining metal, you will usually get a set amount of ore, but it will be within a range, like between 1 and 2 or 3 and 5. And when you create items when crafting, you will have certain RNG elements go along with the crafting process. Now, they did say there will be no random stats on items. So you will not create an item and it just have random stats. The randomization will be in the gathering and in the making of the item, not necessarily the outcome of the crafting process. And now it has come time, my friends, to talk about schematics. This is the general name for recipes within Pantheon Rise of the Fallen. Every trade skill will have their own schematic name. I believe, for instance, blacksmithing will have molds, and that outfitting will probably have patterns and so on and so forth, each one with their own little flavor. Each schematic will have a limit to the number of items that you can craft from it, meaning that once you have created that amount of limit, then you will have to get another schematic. The schematic will also inform the player of the components required to craft. This will be a general kind of thing where it'll say, for instance, if you're making a sword or a piece of armor, it needs 2 metal bars and then a bunch of other components that are potentially made from other schematics. Basic schematics will be able to be purchased from merchants. They will be rewards from quests, both large and small. Rare schematics will most likely have to be found or gotten through factions. It has been emphasized heavily that factions will play a really big role in acquiring schematics, and that some items entirely will be gated behind certain factions. So you may even have to choose between several different factions to be able to get the items that you want, and one faction choice may lock you out of another. Though I am unsure as to whether that was mentioned in passing or if that is the actual direction that they are going to go. It may not be that it locks you out. It may just be that you have to choose to dedicate the time to get the faction reputation needed to be able to get the schematics you want. So if you please, take that last bit with just the slightest grain of salt. All right, so one of the reasons that has been offered to help justify the schematic scheme is that it will help in controlling the scarcity of the item without having to control for rare mats that may drop. One of the easiest ways that other games have done it is to just increase the rarity of all the mats that are required for it. But that has other compounding side effects. So you may know 50 different epic/legendary super awesome items, but you can't hardly make any of them because the mats are so freaking rare. Whereas you can perhaps increase the drop rate of many of the mats, but have the actual schematic itself be rare, and that way you will limit the amount of these items that are in the world and in the economy without necessarily having to limit the mats themselves. Now, one of the things that was brought up in the forums that I kind of agree with is that this just makes it another drop, quote unquote, or more accurately, an item that needs to be farmed, which is just like any other thing you'd have to farm. But one thing I will go so far as to say is that I actually kind of like this, and it's not for any logical reason, to be fair. It's more about the fact that I want to see how it will actually work in the game. I'm curious to see if this will help with that issue of in-game gear being able to be crafted in massive amounts unless all the mats for it are extremely rare. And so what that means is you can have plenty of rare materials available, but only a handful or a few or, however many people are actually have the schematic. That means you limit the schematic in the world. It also means that they can go back after the fact and lower the drop rate or increase the drop rate of the schematic itself to ensure that enough of these items are in the environment depending on how the game is progressing, which, at least in theory, sounds better than increasing the drop rate of rare mats, so that you don't affect every other thing in the economy, you only affect these specific items, which, like I said, in theory, sounds like it might work a little bit better. And craftable items will have different flavors based on the region or continent that you are on in the game, or specifically the faction that the schematic may come from. And they even alluded to base gear near the beginning of the game that you'll be able to craft will have a different look if you're a human rather than a scar, which makes complete sense from lore purposes. And that as you level up, some of these differences may become even more pronounced because there will be certain materials that you gather that will only come from very specific places in the world. And so the cultures that exist on or near those places will have different looks about them because of this reality. And to touch a little bit more on customization of gear, you will be able to customize some of the stats and the appearance a little bit of the items that you make. Now, as we said earlier, the type of material that you use will usually determine the stats, and that's how you customize stats. And the appearance, I believe, can be customized within a certain limitation for each item and depending on what type of cultural item or regional item you make. If you make a scimitar made by the Scar, it will probably look different than ones made by the ogres or the ones made by humans. Swinging back around to gathered resources, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the things that I've gathered, from VR about them specifically. They will be bulky, which means heavy. And one can assume here that they mean things like ores and potentially big pieces of wood and or large vegetables, plants that you have to collect. They will have a low stat count, so you'll only be able to carry so many at any given time, especially because of weight and low stat count. Nuggets are precious metals used primarily for jewel crafting. Chunks will be heavy metals, like for blacksmithing, and I imagine that there will be wood resources and even plants that fall along similar lines. And all, if not most, of your crafting material that you will find will be in nodes, with the exception of fishing, which may have nodes if you're underwater, but will most likely be freeform with a fishing pole and a body of water. They also said it will be one of the ways, but not the only way. So one could assume that you can get some of these gathering materials as loot from mobs, quest rewards, faction rewards, etc., etc. The climate you are in and the time of day may also affect resource node spawns, and they will be everywhere in the world, including dungeons and very, very dangerous places. And you will need to explore to find many of these nodes, as they will not be easily seen from the road or mount, and they will not spawn in predictable loops. Random respawns will happen within set locations. I'll repeat that. Random respawns within a set number of locations. So only a certain number of the spawn locations will spawn, and they will be random within those set locations. But they do say they are practical locations, so not necessarily under every rock and tree kind of deal. Caves and rocky areas will have ore, as expected, and forests will have more wood, as one would expect. I find myself rather intrigued by this. I don't know of any other MMOs that have done it that I've played specifically, but I disliked the node hunting in WoW, because once you understood where they were going to be, you could literally just go circle after circle after circle on like a 5 or 10 minute run, and you could just get massive amounts of stuff, and you wouldn't need to really explore anything once you knew where they all were, which were all posted on the internet, let's be real, which made hunting down these things rather trivial once everybody knew where they were. Now, a similar thing might happen with this system, but at least it'll be harder. There is said to be about 150 ore nodes around Thronefast alone. Now, not all of them will be spawned, of course. But what that means is that there's going to be a lot of nooks and crannies that you're going to want to check. So if you are just going out to just gather resources, you're going to have to go all over the place to ensure that you've gotten everything, which will require you to explore more of the map and interact with more of the scenery / mobs that you need to deal with to be able to get this material. All starting areas and races will have access to all the crafting and harvesting, and resources will be relatively consistent at the beginning and will only deviate as the level increases. So all the starting quote-unquote mats will be the same across most of the starting cities. And the deviation that comes from higher levels will be based on region and continent. There will also be large nodes for group harvesting, which I don't even know what to think about that, to be quite honest. Sounds interesting, I guess. I'm going to be fun to see how they implement it. I guess we'll have gathering parties that you can gather for. Tee-hee. Crafting and gathering skills will have a skill association, as I mentioned earlier. Details exactly about how this skill association will work have been relatively sparse, but it will also require tools to gather and craft, and your skill will be improved by them, and possibly also have gear that would improve your crafting and or your gathering skill as well. The tools have been confirmed, the gear has not. Also confirmed by Neffel on one of VR's live streams is that you will be able to, for the most part, be a pure crafter if you want to. You will have to accept the fact that you will not be able to go out and gather every single material because that would require adventuring. So as long as you're willing to use other players to advance your craft, you should be able to roleplay as a pure crafter. As far as I can tell, based on the live streams and the forums, there will be no level requirement to craft, though you will have to purchase most of your things from other players or occasionally merchants. Mass producing for skill ups will have diminishing returns. The alternative to raising your skill via mass production will be to craft not only a variety of things, but also there will be in-game and gameplay things that you can do other than just crafting to level up your skills. Quests will be one way to raise your skill, as well as other things out in the world that you may encounter on your adventures will help you raise your crafting skill. By how much and how many times you will encounter these different things is unknown at this time. There will be skills for refining raw materials that you gather in the world. I'm unsure at this moment exactly how these refining skills will work. I really haven't seen too much specified on them, but the one thing we do know that is specified is that they will have their own tricks. One could infer that because ore is usually always smelted in games like this, that there would be other refining methods for the other gathering skills as well. Like, you would also have a process of shaping wood, tanning leather, processing meat and vegetables and other giblets that you might get from animals and potentially people out in the wild. It will be interesting to see if these refining skills have their own, quote, skill, unquote, but it could also be smart if they tied the refining skill to the gathering skill. So that way you're not incentivized to just go out and mine even when you don't need the materials just to increase your skill ups. The refining method could be a way to pad your skills so that you're not creating this situation where people will mine nodes and take mats away from potentially other players just to get those skill ups. And create situations where the individual needs these high-end metals or other gathered resources and cannot get them, or it takes inordinate amounts of effort to get them simply because they don't have enough skill. This actually happened a lot in WoW, to the point where it actually became a meme, where if you're not consistently all the time hunting down those mining nodes, then by the time you get to higher levels where you can mine higher level items, you just do not have the skill and it will lock you out of even being able to try to mine them. Now, I know that it won't have that in Pantheon, but the devs have said that if you don't have the adequate skill and tools, then it will take you far longer than it normally would. And I just see this as a way to prevent that if you tether the gathering skill to the refining skill in some way, either by direct combination or complementation of the two. So we touched on salvaging a little bit earlier, and I just wanted to talk about the fact that we will have salvaging in this game, and the main purpose will be being able to pull items out of the world. One of the things salvaging will allow you to do is for a chance for you to get some of the components back from your crafting, even the rare components. And this is not a new thing and has been in games for quite a while now. Joppa has also mentioned that you will be able to sacrifice items for some type of benefit. It's unknown at this time what that benefit is. It still remains nebulous, but it's definitely something that they have stated on several occasions, I believe, that they want to be able to give players the option to do so for some type of benefit. Is this part of the salvaging system in and of itself? I don't think so. I think this is more of a thing that he's hinted at for several years that will do the stated goal of pulling items in general out of the world so that there's not an overabundance of everything in the game. This kind of system is thinking more long-term game so that in, 5 years down the road after the game releases, there will be incentive to sacrifice items or give up your items so that there are not an overabundance of really good items in the game. And that perhaps it would give the devs the ability to perhaps throttle these items in general. So I'm going to touch on a few of the specifics of individual crafting professions. Now, I don't believe that Pantheon Rise of the Fallen is going to deviate overly much from the general way that things like blacksmithing, woodworking, and so on work. However, there are a few diamond-encrusted beans that we have picked up on things like Provisioner and Jewel Crafter, and we'll touch on those briefly. Provisioner will be able to make food and drink with buffs. Now, that sounds like something that we've all heard of before and whatnot, but what they really want to do is they want to make it have a continuous effect, not something that you eat and you gain a buff. It's something that I believe that you will have in your inventory and gain a passive buff from. And the first food that you're going to have in the game is going to give you a small regen buff while you use it. So while you're resting, and I do believe even in combat, that it will give you a like +1 HP, +1 mana regen while you have it in your inventory. Other food will give better regen buffs, and some food may give no regen buff. It may give other buffs you may desire, like stats, status effects, or even acclimation, which will allow you to more easily acclimate to certain climates that will be in the game. Now we're going to touch on jewel crafting just a tiny bit. And one of the reasons is because it was brought up in one of the dev live streams about EQ's crafting system for jewel crafting, where almost everything was bought from merchants. And it was asked if everything in Pantheon's jewel crafting system will be bought from merchants. And the answer is no. It will not. You will not be required to buy everything from merchants to do jewel crafting, like EQ. And thank the gods. And a few rando bits of info that I've picked up from some of these that don't really fit anywhere else in here, but I thought I'd put them out there just for relevance sake. There will be 17 types of mineable ore, and they will contain different quantities of various metals. These will be revealed through the smelting process. Now, I've heard some people say that, oh my God, 17 types of ore sounds like a whole lot, and they're right. But I believe the way that they're going to do this is there's going to be all kinds of ore out in the world that are going to contain the various types of base metals that we're going to need, from copper to tin and iron and so forth. And so when you actually go out and mine these nodes, you'll get some of that ore, and then when you smelt it, you'll get these base metals out of it once you've smelted, which is kind of an interesting process that way you know to look for a certain type of ore so that you know, oh, this one has more iron than it does tin or copper. So you're going to want to pick and choose which nodes you're actually going to mine based on your knowledge of the node's actual metal content. Now, this may or may not have the intended effect. I imagine a lot of people, especially at the beginning, are going to just mine literally everything, but you may need to get more specific later in the game or even early in the game because of things like inventory space and weight that are going to be able to affect how you actually loot these things. And while it's not traditionally how most MMOs do it, where you run up on a copper node and it's all copper, and you run up on an iron node and it's all iron, it is more, I want to say, authentic or, quote, realistic, unquote, because in real life, I hate to bring that up for a video game, but it's somewhat relevant. When you find, let's say, iron in rock, if it's got like 20% iron, that's considered iron rich, right? So when you normally find metals in ore, or when you normally find metals in rock and mine them, usually the process is far more complicated than, oh, look, there's all this iron that's right there and that. I could just smack it and I can pull it out of the rock. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think that this system will make it a little more authentic in that way, where, oh, I've got this huge chunk of metal and it contains, 15% iron, 20% copper, 10% this, and, 5% unusable rock that I can't even have. And that would be kind of cool, I think. And I believe it would also contribute to there being more variety in the game, instead of just, oh, I'm in the level 40 area so I can mine dark iron, or I'm in the level 30 area so I can mine iron. It'll be a little bit more complicated than that, which I think is fine. We will just have to see how they end up implementing the system, and then we'll go from there. And as far as things that I want to see in crafting, as someone who does occasionally like to roleplay as a crafter, is a trading UI for crafting specifically. So if you want to hire a crafter to craft an item, instead of having to give them the mats and then them make the item and then give you the result, especially if they could fail, what I would like to see is a trade menu where you can put the mats into the trade menu and have the crafter use their crafting skill at like their workbench or whatever, And you give a price for the completed item and a price for the failure, so you're still paying for the crafter's time and effort, but if they don't actually complete the item, then you don't have to pay full price. And this is all done via the UI. And I know that this will take away a little bit from the community-driven aspect that they're trying to put in the game, but you'll still have, I want to sell my profession. It'll just take away the 2 or 3 extra trades that you'll have to go through to actually have to have a person make the item. The idea is that instead of having to hand them the item, they make it, and then they give it back to you. You put the item in the trade bar or in the trade menu, and then they make the item, and then the item appears in the trade menu, and you can just take it from there, and they take their gold. Or if it fails, it lets you know that it failed, and then they can take their gold, and then you could take your mats back that were not destroyed, if any were. And while the argument that it will take a little bit away from that community-driven thing is possibly true and has a little bit of merit, I believe that it will also minimize scamming people with trading. Because in a game where you can fail and lose a bunch of mats, I foresee this being not a necessarily big problem, but somebody's going to do it. And it's going to be a problem for the person that gets scammed, right? And you don't really want that. And there is a way to make it to where you don't have to. And it would be a crafting UI that allows you to trade with your crafting skill without ever touching the crafting items that the buyer is giving you. All right, my dudes, I think that's gonna wrap up our video today. I want to thank you guys for being here and being freaking awesome as you are. Thank you so much for spending your time here at the Tango Hotel, and I hope you guys had a great time. I know I did. This video has been a hell of an undertaking, and I put in a lot of god-awful work. So thank you guys for sticking through it. And if you like what you hear, you like what you see, don't forget to throw a like and a subscribe. You know, for the algorithm gods, let them know the things you like. And if you'd like to see me make content live, I do so every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday at noon Central Standard Time at twitch.tv/Tango Hotel. That's twitch.tv/Tango Hotel. My dudes, my bros, my homies. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today, and I will see you guys next time. Peace out.